Makes Me Wanna Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 8. Power. I witnessed the power of the gun close up one night when I saw Scobie shoot a guy. I was 15, and I had gone to a pool party at the Cavalier Manor Recreation Center and was standing around outside when a major fight broke out between Scobie's boys and a group of guys who didn't live in our neighborhood. The other guys broke out running, but Scobie and his boys caught up with one of them before he reached the bus stop at Greenwood Drive, about 100 yards away. I run along with the crowd to watch the rumble and was standing less than 10 feet away when they caught the dude. Scobie ran up to him, pointing the gun barrel at his stomach and shot him at point blank range. The guy slumped to the ground. As everybody scrambled to get away, I stood there a moment and stared at him lying motionless in the dirt. Then I took off running along with everybody else. For much of that night, I lay awake in bed thinking about what I'd seen and wondering if the guy would live or die. It bothered me that I left somebody like that who might be dying, but I wasn't about to snitch on Scobie or anybody else. The next day, when the fellas and I met at our corner, we talked admiringly about Scobie, about how wild he was, how he would shoot anybody for looking at him the wrong way. We said over and over, that nigga is crazy. Scobie eventually was arrested and charged with the shooting. The man he shot survived, and I think Scobie got off with probation. That was the amazing thing about Scobie. He always seemed to get away with the wild things he did. Nobody ever associated consequences with him. Scobie had a reputation for being trigger happy, long before most dudes on the block even thought about carrying guns. He was notorious for flashing all kinds of guns at the basketball court. Whenever he got into arguments on the court, guys began gathering their coats because they knew he was packing. The disputes often ended with him running to get a gun from his coat or storming off to his house a few blocks away and returning with one of the many pieces he owned. He'd return, cussing, foam forming in the corners of his mouth, the veins in his neck bulging like they were about to snap, and that flaming red afro would look like it was on fire like the rest of them. He'd open fire, tap, 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 sending everybody scattering. Guys would leap over the tall fence or dive to the ground when he started shooting. It was some sight to see one dude make hundreds of people scramble for cover in all directions like that. That was power. We were lounging around in a friend's living room one day when he stood up and announced, "I got something to show you." The friend, a guy named Bobby, was a goofy dude, more soft-edged than most of us. He wanted to hang with the fellas and me and was trying to impress us any way he could. He went into his parents' bedroom and returned, gloating with his father's gun. Check this out. He proudly passed the unloaded piece around the room for us to hold and examine. Awestruck, dudes caressed it, squeezed the trigger several times and talked about its power. They even took turns stuffing the piece under their belts to see how easily it could be concealed. When it was my turn to hold it, I gently cradled it in the palm of my hand and turned it at various angles, carefully examining its features. I marveled at its size. I had never held a gun that small before. Occasionally, when my parents were away, I toyed with my stepfather's gun, a .38 service revolver that he used on his job as security guard at the shipyard. He kept it in his dresser drawer when he was off duty, but it was bulky, nothing like the pearl-handled black and chrome .22 Bobby showed me. A lightweight piece, it could fit snugly in your pants with barely a bulge. A dude could stick it in his pocket and walk along a crowded downtown street and no one even suspect he was packing a piece. It was beautiful. I fantasized about owning it. I even inspected the cone-shaped bullets that came with it and considered that each one carried within its shell the power to take a human life. I felt that sense of power even more after we pitched in and brought a box of bullets of our own to try it out. Bobby sneaked the gun out of the house and we went into the woods near Crystal Lake and took turns shooting it. When my turn came, I held it tightly with 2 hands, closed my eyes, and squeezed the trigger. I can't describe the exhilaration I felt when I fired that gun. I was smitten by its power and what it symbolized. Instantly, I understand why Scobie was hooked on guns. In many ways, high school marked a turning point for me. Most important, it marked the end of school days insulated in the neighborhood. When we started going to Woodrow Wilson High School across town, we got to a place where the tensions flowed in many directions. Between blacks and whites, between Cavalier Manor boys and downtown boys who also went to school there, even between my gang and other young groups from different parts of Cavalier Manor. Those tensions heightened during football season, when groups of guys ran into each other at games. By the time I was 15, the fellas and I had solidly established ourselves as a combative bunch of young hoods. We often went to school dressed alike, sat together, and raised hell during Friday morning pep rallies. Pumped up with the testy rumbling spirit of Cavalier Manor, we'd pile into cars and go to nighttime football games, armed with assorted knives and Bobby's father's .22. At halftime, we'd pip around to the visitor side of the field, profiling and rapping the girls from competing schools. Other groups of dudes did the same thing. I saw them eyeing us, and we returned to hostile glares. Look at them punk motherfuckers. They think they bad. Tension also flowed heavy at school-related parties, especially those outside of Cavalier Manor. I loved those parties as much for the danger they posed as for fun we had. When the music slowed, you could find me standing in the middle of the floor, slow dragging hard with some bait I hone in on. Fraud Dickie, with his short self, might be dancing nearby with his head barely reaching up to some chick's breast. Lep, who always kept a towel slung over his shoulder to wipe the sweat, would lean his slow dance partners against the wall to get better leverage to grind on them. And Shane, who never could dance well, would be doing his fucked up version of the 2-step slow grind. Instead of shifting from one leg to the other in time with the tune, he stayed locked on one leg, like he was dancing to a scratched record. The other fellas would be somewhere nearby, talking trash, joning, and waiting for trouble to jump off with dudes from other groups. The specter of a rumble after football games and parties always hung heavy. Often, all it took was a minor excuse, an accidental brush against some dude's coat sleeve or a misunderstood look to trigger a brawl or a shooting. Our first rumble involved rival groups in my own neighborhood. It was sparked partly by an old friend of mine from the 5th grade, a guy we called Shell Shock, who started swinging with the fellas and me when we got to high school. He had a brown belt in karate and had earned a strong rep in Cavalier Manor by kicking out the front teeth of an established old hood who hung with Scobie. That was some feat since the hood, known as Joe Ham, was no chump, and since he was a full 4 years older than Shell Shock. After that, people thought Shell Shock was a bona fide crazy nigga with a strong nut game. Shell Shock and I grew tight. He was kinda slow in school, but he seemed to know more than the rest of us about the streets. He showed me how to take a spent bullet shell and shape it to fit around my tooth so that it looked like I had a shiny gold cap. One night, a bunch of us were standing on our corner, drinking wine, when Shell Shock said he had a beef with a group of dudes known as the Cherry Boys. We played football against them sometimes and ran into them at parties. The Cherry Boys began coming to our bus stop some mornings to rap to girls who lived around our way. Shell Shock said, we should fuck them up and put a stop to that. It was a dumb excuse to fight, but we were so pumped up and anxious to fight somebody, anybody, that we went along. Bobby sneaked his old man's gun out the house one morning and we headed to the bus stop to put the Cherry Boys in check. I made sure I was carrying a piece. I tucked it into my belt and bopped in front of the crowd, feeling like I was the baddest nigga on the East Coast. We reached the bus stop and started throwing down. We had them outnumbered and clearly were beating them when I drew the piece. I shoved it to the temple of a guy named Jimmy and went into my Scobie D macho act. Make a move, motherfucker, and I'ma blow you away. I hadn't thought beforehand how far I'd go with the crazy nigga at. And you don't think like that when you're in that frame of mind. I do know that I had no intention of killing anybody. But for a minute, I got so caught up in the excitement of the moment that I started to pull the trigger to blow the guy away. It was nothing personal. Actually, he was a likable guy. But for that moment, in my head, I was Scooby D, a crazy nigga, and my audience was 50 or so mesmerized school kids watching. As I stood there, holding that pistol barrel flush against the side of Jimmy's head, everybody grew silent. That was my moment. On some level, I felt pressured by the expectations I created to complete the scene and thrill the crowd. If I offed Jimmy, it would be talked about in the streets for years after that. I'd claim my men in the glory, and people would pay me the ultimate tribute. Nate McCall blew that nigga's head off. He's a crazy motherfucker. I don't know why I didn't shoot. It's likely that Jimmy's total surrender sobered me. He stood there, his eyes bulging, his body stark still, with his hands raised skyward as far as they would go. Don't shoot, man, don't shoot. I calmed down and pulled the gun away, satisfied that I publicly chumped him down. I can never forget that moment. Whenever I hear about shootings now, I try to imagine what happened in the gunman's head. I try to imagine what he was thinking, because I know the feeling of standing there with all that power literally at one's fingertips. For someone who has felt powerless and ignored all his life, that's one hell of an adrenaline rush. After the fellas and I were content that we'd whipped the Cherry Boys, we let them go. They limped away, battered and bruised, and we celebrated the triumph of our first real throwdown. Did you see that nigga's face when I hit him? I cold cocked his ass. Yeah, I saw him. Them pussies ain't got no heart. But that wasn't the end of it. The Cherry Boys regrouped to retaliate. They found allies in some of the older hoods, many of whom didn't like shell-shocking me. They questioned my loyalty to Cavalier Manor because I had pierced my ear and gotten a gold tooth, fashions that were popular among downtown boys. They considered me the ringleader in the rumble and made it clear that I was tops on their hit list. When I saw the Cherry Boys again, I was alone and unarmed. They jumped me outside a party on a Sunday night. They were closing in, rushing me from all sides when an older, well-respected hood stepped in and saved me, because the odds were so uneven. I survived that lightweight clash with only a few scratches to my face. When I got home, I telephoned all the fellas to talk about getting some get back. I didn't hear the same cockiness in some of my guys' voices that had been there before. They didn't sound like they were into the rumble for the long haul. I sensed then that I was doomed. I called Bobby. I need the peace. We're gonna rumble again tomorrow at the bus stop. He said, I can't get it, man. I think my old man is gonna be home. By then I was desperate. You gotta get it. I gotta get some get back. He said, I'll see what I can do. I'll meet you out there tomorrow. The next morning, I woke up feeling nervous as hell. My intuition was on fire, telling me that only a faithful few of the fellas would show. Before walking out the door, I hesitated near the kitchen where my mother was cooking. I considered telling her that I expected big trouble at the bus stop. I thought about asking her to drive me to school, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. How could I turn punk after having been so bad before? How could I face all my people I tried to impress at the bus stop the previous week? I had to go. I went out into the backyard and broke a broom handle against the side of the concrete porch. Then I left with my makeshift club and went down the block to meet the fellas. When I got there, nobody had shown up but Shane and Shell Shock. Bobby was nowhere in sight. We waited a while, then gave up. I said, come on, man, let's go on out there. Them motherfuckers ain't running me off my block. We walked slowly toward the bus stop. I could see off in the distance that there was a larger than usual gathering at the corner of Roosevelt and Cavalier Boulevards. Word had spread that there was going to be another big rumble, and people have come from everywhere to watch. The Cherry Boys, as well as some older hoods, were out there in full force, waiting to do battle. I don't know how Shane and Shell Shock felt. We walked in silence, but I was scared to death. All of a sudden, I didn't want to be rock hard anymore. I would have given anything to be a regular schoolboy, a no-name lame with no rep to defend, to go to school and do my classwork, to have the freedom to be scared, unbound by false bravado. But I crossed the line and was compelled by teenage illogic to go all the way. So I walked on towards my crucifixion. As we approached the corner, about 30 guys, led by the Cherry Boys, met us in the middle of the street. Some had lead pipes and other carried clubs. I suspected there was a concealed gun or two in the crowd. Most of them also were wearing heavy brogans. In those days, one of the fashions for serious dumpers was baggy khakis and spit-shine steel-toed brogans. The bros, as we called them, were good fighting shoes, used for landing a hard kick to the nuts or delivering a severe stomp into a fallen foe. When we met in the street, I held up my hand to call a truce. Before I could speak, somebody snuck me and punched me in the face. I swung back and kept swinging until there were so many of them swarming around me, throwing punches, that I couldn't move my arms. I felt myself being knocked off balance. I tried desperately to stay on my feet, fearing what would happen if I hit that ground, and it did happen. I fell and felt the force and number of blows multiply as they kicked me with their bros and beat me with pipes and clubs. The pain ricocheted like a pinball from my head to my toes and back again. I curled up in the fetal position and tried to cover my head to cushion the blows. I felt myself fading and remember thinking that I had to hold on, that eventually they would have to stop. But it seemed an eternity passed and the beating went on. Then my fear turned to horror. The horror that comes the instant you realize that they have no way of knowing when they've gone too far. They don't know how many blows to the head will bring permanent damage or death. I wanted to scream, as much in fear as in pain, but I held back. Only punks cry out. Men take their lumps. Eventually though, an involuntary wail worked its way from the pit of my throbbing gut to my aching throat and shoved its way through my bleeding mouth. It wasn't a manly sound. It was more like a pleading cry. I had never heard that sound come from me before. It competed against the ring of pipe against my body and the thud of bros against my head. I kept thinking, they gotta stop. They're gonna kill me. They're gonna kill me. Then, almost as suddenly as it started, it ended. There was silence. I was so fucked up I felt high, paralyzed, like all the time was suspended as I lay there in the street, writhing in pain. Somebody, I don't know to this day who it was, lifted me off the ground. There was one person on each side of me. They threw my arms over their shoulders and lugged me toward my house, which was less than 2 blocks away. My mouth bled so much that I almost gagged on my own blood. My vision was blurred, but I could make out the images of concerned neighbors who had run out of their houses were standing around staring. I saw Shane lying on the ground inside the neighbor's fence where he had been beaten and tossed over. I didn't see Shell Shock anywhere. As I was being carried toward my house, a group of little kids approached. They were leaving the cul-de-sac headed for school. My 7-year-old brother Brian was among them. I saw the shock on his face when he saw me, bloodied and limp. Somebody screamed, "Get him away from here. He don't need to see this." They took me inside the house and laid me down on the living room floor. My mother, shocked, ran and got her coat and car keys and instructed my helpers to lift me into the back seat of the car. She sped me to the Portsmouth Naval Hospital emergency room. White doctors placed me on an examining room table and began asking questions in the slow, deliberate manner that doctors have. Where does it hurt? Can you lift your arm? Are you allergic to any medication? I grew impatient. How can I tell them where it hurts? It hurts all over. I just wanted the doctors to shut up and stop the pain. My body felt like a battered heap of broken bones. I spent the day at the hospital and eventually learned where the damage was done. The doctor said there had been injuries to my vertebrae. They put my neck in a brace. They put my arm in a sling and treated me for bruised ribs. My face was swollen. Several of my teeth had been knocked loose. The tip of the fake gold bullet cap fitted over one of my teeth had been knocked up into my gums, cutting them badly. Assorted other pains roamed my body. I stayed home in bed more than a week recuperating. In that time, I relived the fight in my mind 1,000 times. Friends called and came by to visit and tell me other details about what had happened. Shane, I learned, took a pretty bad beating, but he was alright. Shell Shock got jumped too, but he also survived. I heard that Fraud Dickie and some of the other fellas had arrived late at our meeting spot. When they came up the street and saw us being double banked, they turned around and ran home. As far as I know, Bobby never showed up with his father's gun. When Shell Shock came over, he suggested that we retaliate against some of our guys for punking out, then getting some get back from the Cherry Boys. But I was in no mood to talk about fighting. Fuck it, man. It doesn't matter. The fight proved some things to me that I sensed all along but never acknowledged. I was too puny to be a heavy thumper. My frail body could never take another beating like that. I also realized that I couldn't depend on other people to come through for me. When we were hanging, the fellas and I had pledged to go down together if and whenever necessary. Now I saw that was mostly talk. If I was going to hang, I needed somebody or something I could depend on always. I needed a piece. Initially, I used Shell Shock's mother's gun, a neat little 2-shot Derringer that fitted nicely into my shirt pocket or pants. A widowed hospital clerk who worked nights. Shell Shock's mother carried it in her purse. He started borrowing the Derringer around the same time he began stealing her car keys to take joyrides and chase girls. Meanwhile, I put the word out on the streets that I was looking for a piece, and somebody came up with exactly what I wanted, a compact 25 automatic. Skull was always known for carrying big guns, 44 Magnums and 357s. Over time, as the gun craze caught on, other dudes began going for bigger, more impressive looking pieces too. Eventually, the fellas and I built an arsenal that included a mix of lightweight and powerful stuff, several handguns, a sawed-off shotgun, and a high-powered .30-30 rifle. We worshipped those guns. We practiced shooting at targets in the woods and took aim in the streets at barking dogs. We sat around some nights, polishing and doting over them, like they were fine ladies we loved. One night, when a bunch of us were sitting around the Shell Shock's dining room, cleaning our weapons and talking, I accidentally almost shot a dude we called Whiskey Bottle. I thought I'd unloaded all the bullets from my gun when I pointed it his way to make a conversational point. Whiskey was standing at the kitchen sink, drinking water when the gun fired. Bam! For a full minute, the world stood still. Everybody in the room, including me, closed their eyes, too scared to look and afraid to speak. Somebody shouted, "Nate!" They just knew I killed Whiskey. When I opened my eyes, I was relieved. Whiskey was still standing. He was shocked and speechless, but alive and well. We all got up from our seats and went over to where he stood and saw that the bullet had struck a cabinet directly beside his head. It missed him by a few inches. Carrying the gun did strange things to my head. Suddenly, I became very much aware that I had the power to alter the fate of anybody I saw. The greatest power on earth is the ability to give life. The next greatest power is the ability to take one. When carrying a gun, I was full of a sense of that power. I felt confident, invincible, like Scooby-Doo. For me, guns were life's great equalizer. When I was armed, the older hoods who had once seemed so intimidating didn't faze me anymore, and I no longer feared going across town or being double banked by 2 or even 20 guys because I had the equalizer. Even grown-ups like my stepfather began to look more vulnerable to me when I had that piece nestled in my belt. My faith in the power of guns shot up a few notches more one night, a few months after I was jumped. I was walking home by myself from a girl's house when the Cherry Boys and some others spotted me and came charging my way. Normally, I would have had to dash or take another head thumping, but I had the loaded 25 tucked into my coat. I had the equalizer and I wasn't scared. I waited until they got within 20 yards of me, drew the gun, aimed, and fired several shots into the crowd. Bam, 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 bam. They dove to the ground and then scattered like flies. It made me feel powerful to be able to scatter a crowd like that. I stood there for a moment, full of the sense of what I'd done. I just stood there and took it in. Then I turned and calmly walked home. I didn't consider the potential consequences of what I'd done until I stepped into the house. Then I got scared and had to force myself to be cool. Mama met me in the living room, pointed the finger and said, "You better stop coming in this house so late on school nights." I stopped, looked at her like she was crazy and shook my head. "Okay, Ma." I wanted to say more. I wanted to tell her what had happened in case the police came by the house. I wanted to say, "Ma, I think I may have shot somebody." Instead, I kept quiet and went to bed. I heard talk the next day that a bullet had grazed a dude's hand. The police never came, but that was no surprise. The Cherry Boys weren't the kind of dudes who would snitch to the cops. I knew that if one of them had been shot, they'd try to get some get back. So I waited, determined not to let them or anybody else catch me unarmed. As long as I had a piece on me, I would fear no man, not even Scooby D.